Let's talk about person perception. Now, social cognition, which is how we process information about other people or their social environment more generally, it follows all the principles that we've been talking about all throughout the course. So now we're going to focus on a few specific theories, explanations, and patterns that psychologists have found when it comes to processing information about other people. So first, let's talk about first impressions, how we get information about a new piece of our social environment, such as a social actor, somebody in our environment. And we'll talk about some features of people that we pick up on automatically. We're going to focus on nonverbal behaviors. This is things like body language that people use. Humans, like other animals, pick up on body language cues. But humans are not like other animals because we also have verbal communication. We have language, spoken language, or signed language, right? Sign language is not nonverbal behavior, right? Nonverbal behavior specifically refers to things that are not a language, right? So we have language in addition to these nonverbal behaviors. So there's that extra layer of interpretation that we have to use. So let's get into it. I want you to think about two scenarios. In the first scenario, you walk into a room and you have to sit down and take a calculus test that you haven't prepared very much for. In the second situation, you walk into a new room and there are a couple people standing around the room doing various activities. You have to determine what the mood is of these people in the room. What are their intentions? Are they happy? Are they sad? What's going on? Imagining these two scenarios, walking in and taking a calculus test you're not prepared for, or meeting new people and determining their mood, which of those seems like the more difficult task? Unsurprisingly, most people say, well, calculus, that's the harder of those two tasks for the average person. Even if you're good at calculus, you might have a relatively difficult time performing a test if you haven't studied for it. But walking into a room and understanding the mood of the other people in the room, that's something that we do so automatically that that doesn't even register to many people as a task that your brain has to perform. What if I were to tell you that computationally, regarding how much power it takes a system, a computer, to do these two tasks, most of what I learned in basic calculus classes a long time ago is relatively easy for a computer to do. But walking into a new or being in a new room and judging the mood of animals in that room, computationally, that's an extremely difficult task. So why is it that if one is much more difficult than the other, humans are able to do the difficult task very easily? Most people can read another person's mood so automatically we don't even register that it's difficult. Evolutionary psychology helps us explain this because one of the principles of evolution is that organisms will, over time, be designed to solve specific tasks in their environment if, over generations, they encounter those tasks again and again. I think that almost none of my ancestors had to deal with calculus on a daily basis, unless we have a mathematician very, very, very far back in the family that I don't know about. But I know for a fact that all of my ancestors that were even remotely human had to deal with social situations in their environment. So it's no surprise to me that human brains are designed with structures with the abilities of social perception that are very, very well integrated into your brain, so much that they seem automatic. This is a case of our brain making a trade-off between accuracy and efficiency. By focusing on efficient processing of social information, because it's a problem that we encounter on a daily basis, our brains are designed not to waste a lot of excess processing power on that. We do it very fast, automatically, and efficiently. Humans are really good at this kind of social processing in most cases. We see this all the way through the lifespan. Even baby humans, a 2-year-old human has approximately the same social perceptive power of an adult chimpanzee. It's kind of an unfair comparison. Maybe a 5-year-old human has surpassed the social power of an adult chimpanzee. We're really good at it, even when we're really young. So yes, we do share these abilities with other similar animals, but ours are, in general, much more advanced. We're really good at it, and we're good at it even if we don't realize it. Do you go by somebody, you go by your first impression of someone, or do you need to get to know someone to understand their personality a little bit better? Most people are not very confident in their first impressions. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover. You should get to know someone before you judge their personality. However, psychologists have found that our first impressions of people are much more accurate than our confidence in those first impressions. You can get a pretty good judge of someone else's characteristics upon first meeting them. If it is true, so theoretically, evolution should have prepared humans for social perception really well. If that hypothesis is true, then there should be matching brain areas that correspond to our perceptual abilities, our social perception abilities. And in fact, we have quite a bit of evidence for this. There are some specific brain areas that appear to be more advanced than other similar animals when it comes to some social perception abilities. A few that I'm familiar with or that are found in your textbook might be the fusiform gyrus, which you'll see referred to as the fusiform face area in some resources. That's because it's specialized for telling faces apart from each other. You can kind of see this in real time. Now, unless you have a specific deficit, then I imagine if I give you a series of, let's say I give you a yearbook from a high school you've never been to, and you can probably tell all the pictures in the yearbook apart from each other pretty easily. However, if I give you a yearbook of sheep, pictures of a graduating class of 100 sheep, it would take you a lot of training in order to tell all those sheep apart from each other. It would take you very little training to tell the people apart. It would take you a lot of training to learn the faces of the sheep. At an information processing level, there is about as much visual variation in human faces as there is in sheep faces. Yet, human faces are much easier for us to tell apart. Why is that? It appears that parts of your brain, such as the fusiform face area, have over evolutionary time become specialized for telling apart human faces in particular. And you have to specially train that area from a young age if you want to tell apart other animals. And it kind of goes against our brain's natural setup. So we are born with this special ability to tell human faces apart from each other, probably because that's the most likely animal we are to spend a lot of time with is each other, humans. There are a few other areas that appear to be particularly active when we are judging the mental state of other people, for example. Some comparison studies from the early 2000s compared brain areas that are active between humans judging other humans versus humans trying to judge things about other things, such as animals. One of the brain areas that is particularly active when humans are judging other humans in particular is the prefrontal cortex. If you remember, that's been mentioned a few times in class because the prefrontal cortex is involved in helping us judge social situations, planning, and self-control. It is an area of the brain that is a little bit more specialized in humans compared to other animals. We're really good at judging the intentions of other humans, and maybe that's the area helping us do that. When it comes to nonverbal behaviors, we must understand that reading the body language of other animals is something that lots of organisms do, not just humans. This is an important skill. If you are a wolf out in the wilderness, you encounter a bear, you need to quickly read its body language to know whether is it going to attack me, is it going to leave me alone, because that helps you allocate your resources. Do I need to run away? Do I need to fight? We're constantly judging the nonverbal behavior of other animals and animals of our own species. For humans, this includes things like how much distance we tend to automatically put between ourselves and other people, whether we're looking at each other in the eye, our posture, our tone of voice. The image on this slide is of two people who have uh, pretty clear body language. They're displaying that they don't want to interact with each other. Even I could notice that, and I'm pretty bad at reading nonverbal cues. Nonverbal communication is any communication that does not involve speaking or language. Okay, this is natural to humans. It appears to be very cross-cultural. It appears to be something that we pick up when we're young, even before we can fully understand spoken language. This helps us interact with each other. If somebody's appearing very closed off, they don't want you to talk to them. If somebody is appearing very inviting, their body language suggests that they're trying to approach you. That may mean that they want some kind of interaction. You have to make a quick determination whether that's a friendly interaction or an angry interaction, and your brain is pretty good at doing that. I was trying to find some more recent studies on nonverbal communication, and I found a really interesting dissertation. Hasn't been published yet, but probably maybe will by the time you watch this video. A researcher was trying to determine that, trying to look at the relationship between especially Middle Eastern college students, who there's some research saying that there's stereotypes about being a little less friendly, a little less approachable. What the researcher did is they presented some experimental manipulations of people interacting with either a Middle Eastern college student or a US born college student. And they had these videos set up where they would vary their body language, the types of things they were talking about, and a few other factors. What the researcher found is that by a pretty simple manipulation of body language, so when they had people in the videos expressing warmth behaviors or approach behaviors, body language that's typically associated with, I want you to interact with me, I'm being more friendly, I'm being more trusting, that the gap between how people perceived Middle Eastern college students versus US born college students closed somewhat. Didn't close entirely, and you can read their whole dissertation if you want to learn more. But this is an interesting application of body language. So when there is doubt about how we are viewing other people, we often go to body language as a first indicator of how we should approach or not approach other people. I thought this is a good demonstration of that. Probably one of the reasons that we do go to body language first automatically is that we may understand intuitively that first impressions are relatively accurate. Humans, we tend to, in surveys, not want to believe that our first impressions are pretty accurate, but in general, they are. There have been quite a few studies on this in quite a few different groups of people. For example, your kind of gut instinct of whether someone that you meet in the United States is a Democrat or Republican is relatively accurate. This has been done, I found, in Europe as well, because they have different political parties, but people can tell whether someone is left-leaning or right-leaning just by their first impressions. There's been studies of both male and female sexual orientation. We have cues about the sexual orientation of people we meet that are relatively accurate. Race as well. Now, you might think racial categories are obvious in some cases because of superficial features like skin color. The researchers here were looking at a racial identity, Jewish, so that's not as obvious at first glance through superficial features like skin color. They found that people could tell the racial group that somebody belonged to pretty accurately based on first impression, even if those obvious cues weren't present. Also, I found a few research studies looking at different religions. We can get a hint at someone's religious identity based on a first impression. In all of these studies, the pattern is that people's actual intuitions about people they're judging were more accurate than they believed their intuitions were. So, yes, just like we believe currently that there is a language specialization in the human brain, that evolutionary psychology would agree with that. That doesn't mean that everybody on the planet speaks the same language. We have the ability for language, but we learn different languages from our environment. Yes, we all process nonverbal cues very easily and very well in most circumstances, but that doesn't mean that every culture has the exact same nonverbal cues. One way I like to display this, if I'm in a room with people from different parts of the country, is to ask, how close do you have to stand to someone before it gets uncomfortable? Think about standing next to a family member, a complete stranger, when there's plenty of room around, or a romantic partner, right? You have your preferences for how close you have to stand to someone to get uncomfortable, but this changes from culture to culture. So, one of the patterns that we found is that in warmer climates, for example, people are more likely to talk with a lot of nonverbal additions. People from the warmer parts of North and South America both, they talk with their hands more often. Warmer climates, you tend to use more nonverbal communication, like talking with their hands. In most South American countries, for example, another norm is to stand very close to someone else when you're engaging with them, much closer than what's the norm in North America, especially Canada. It's also more appropriate in North and South America to look someone else right in the eyes when you're communicating. But there's a ton of variation on this between Africa and Asia. So many places, I know Japan is one of the studies I've read about. It is much less common to look someone directly in the eyes, especially if they are your supervisor, right? But in the United States in particular, it is not only normal to do that, but in many places it's expected that you do that. So there's cross-cultural variation, right? All cultures know that in some cases it is appropriate and others it's not. I've noticed that I do talk with my hands a lot more than many of my colleagues when I'm teaching in the colder regions in the United States because I'm originally from a much hotter region. Haven't read studies in particular comparing those two cultures, but it follows the general trend. Now, different cultures do have different standards. One thing that we find across different cultures, though, is what we call the negative bias in person perception. There is a bias we may have mentioned before, where if someone is even slightly threatening, your brain kind of latches onto that and picks up on threatening cues and remembers them, and they become much more salient in your social environment. So if someone displays anger, in almost every culture, we have the same sensitivity to anger. So different cultures might have different sensitivity to detecting happiness on someone else's face. Some people are very quick to say that that person looks happy. In other cultures, you must really display a lot of emotion on your face before someone judges you happy. But in most cultures that have been studied, people pick up on anger, even if you only display a little bit of anger on your face. One of the experimental studies looking at this negativity bias showed participants a lineup of a bunch of faces displaying different emotions. For example, maybe there's a lineup where there's 8 happy faces and 1 angry face. You take the faces away and you bring a new set of pictures back of more happy and angry people, and you ask the participants, which of these people have you seen before and which are new faces? Well, if someone sees a happy face and it pops up again in the next slide, they remember it. Sometimes they don't remember it other times. But studies like this have found that the angry faces, if they pop up again, are almost always recognized. Participants remember the angry face. And in the natural social environment that we're all in, if you scan the room and you see someone that's angry, you're much more likely to pick up on that, and you're much more likely to look back, get a second look, figure out why that person is angry, And you find this across many different cultures. We're going to switch gears now and talk about, once you have scanned your social environment, one thing that you are likely to do is try to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. And we're calling this the study of causal attribution. Causal attribution, I'll show you some more definitions here soon, is when you make a determination about what is causing someone to act the way that they do. And we'll talk about some of the factors that lead us to ascribe different causes, different attributions to someone's behavior. In general, the two broadest categories of attribution would be, is someone acting that way because it's a person variable, something inside of themselves causing them to act that way, or is it an environment variable? Is something around them causing them to act that way? I've accidentally left my camera on, right? When I'm recording the lecture, I've accidentally left my camera on after I meant to stop recording. And you see me in the background of my office, and I start smashing things. I start throwing books on the floor. I start knocking the cabinet over. Things like that are happening. When you see that, you are going to automatically try to determine the attribution of my behavior. You could maybe make an internal attribution. I start trashing my office. It's because I'm an angry person. I must be if I'm trashing my office. Maybe you make an external attribution, a situational attribution. He's destroying his office. Maybe there's something going on in his environment that is making him angry. We don't know which of those is correct, right? If you caught me on video doing that, you don't know if it's because I'm an angry person or if something happened that made me do that. What we're going to be talking about is your perception of another person, right? We never know for sure whether your perception is accurate or not. So we're going to be talking just about your judgment, a little bit about when it can be more or less accurate, but in many cases you never know for sure. Let me give you another common example. You just took an exam and you got your score back already, and you did really well on that exam. You are going to automatically make an attribution, a guess of where that behavior came from. You did well on the exam, and you're probably going to either make an internal or an external attribution for your exam score. Internal might be, I did well on the exam because I'm an intelligent person and a hard worker. You might make an external attribution. I did well on the exam because of something outside of myself. The exam was really easy. You're also going to make either a stable or unstable attribution about your exam score. So I did well on the exam, I am an intelligent person, and that is a pretty stable trait that I have. Or it could be unstable. I did well on the exam, I am a hard worker, I'm really intelligent, but that changes from week to week based on my motivation. Some weeks I'm a hard worker, other weeks I'm not. That would be an unstable attribution of your own behavior. And finally, local versus global refers to whether the attribution of your own behavior applies only to the situation or applies across multiple situations. If you think, for example, I did really well on this exam because I am a hard worker, I'm consistently a hard worker, but only when it comes to this class. That is a localized attribution. If instead you think I did well on this exam because I'm a hard worker and in many areas of my life, I'm a hard worker. That is a global attribution. So that's one part of attribution theory is you are constantly judging what caused your own behavior. And you may recognize something that we'll talk about in a minute, which is that you are more likely to make internal attributions when the behavior that you're doing is good. You enjoy that you did that behavior. So I did well on the exam because I'm an intelligent person. That's an internal attribution. But what if you go to the next class, take that exam and you fail? Are you likely to say, I failed that exam because I'm not very intelligent? Some people will make that attribution, but on average, you're more likely to say, I failed that exam because the exam was too difficult. That's an external attribution of your own behavior. So when you're making causal attributions, you are making conscious or unconscious judgments about what caused you to act that way. You can apply this not just to yourself, but to other people as well. When you're making a dispositional attribution, that is when you're judging that another person did something because of something about them. A situational attribution is they performed that behavior because of the situation that they were in. I'm walking around campus with my friend. He will not stop talking. We walk into the coffee shop. He's talking the entire time, even while we try to order. We walk outside. I'm trying to pay attention across the street. He keeps talking. We walk into the library. All of a sudden, he is completely silent. Not just whispering, he just stops talking when we walk into the library. I'm unconsciously and automatically making a causal attribution of what do I think his behavior is a result of. In this case, when we walk into the library and he stops talking, I'm going to make a situational attribution. Something about libraries makes him stop talking. He likes to be quiet in libraries. I also then make the determination that him being extremely talkative maybe is unstable, because in some situations he was extremely talkative, but when we went to another situation, he stopped talking. So it's not that he's always talking all the time. I'm realizing there's some situations in which he does talk frequently. There's other situations in which he doesn't. We're constantly doing things like this all the time, anytime we witness another behavior or we think about our own behaviors. Dispositional attribution, once more, means that I attribute your behavior to your disposition, something about you, characteristics of you. Talked to my brother on the phone after we both get off work today. He tells me a story about how he was helping someone at his job. Making a dispositional attribution means what my brain takes away from that story is he helped someone out at work because he's a helpful person. A situational attribution means I attribute your behavior to the situation. I hang up the phone on my brother, my mom calls. And she tells me a story about how she tried to help someone at work and ended up yelling at somebody. She yelled at somebody at work. It was an unpleasant situation. I might make a situational attribution. She's telling me a story about how she yelled at somebody. I bet it was her social environment that pushed her to that behavior. I'm making a situational attribution. Now, these two examples, I want to display that we are biased in certain ways. Sometimes we're more likely to make dispositional, sometimes we're more likely to make situational attributions. When I have a family member telling me about something positive they did, I'm more likely to make a dispositional attribution. You did a good thing, it's because you're a good person. If I hear a family member tell me about something they did that was not good, you yelled at somebody at work, I'm making a situational attribution because I think you're a good person that did a bad thing. I bet the situation forced you to do that. So not only are we more likely to bias or attributions about ourselves to make us look better, we apply that to other people we know as well. Let's talk about the locus of control. What does that term mean? When you see the term locus of control, that's kind of just referring to whether that behavior is controlled by internal attributes, dispositional traits, or external attributes, something to do with the situation. So, like I said, when it's yourself, you make self-serving attributions. When good things happen, you attribute them to something internal to you. You do something bad, you're more likely to think something in the situation outside of yourself caused you to do bad. So we can look at locus of control. That's whether the control of your behavior is in your control or outside of you. Somebody else could control their own behavior, or they're in a situation. Again, let's look at stability. Stability means, is that a consistent behavior, or is that a behavior that's going to change across different situations? Going back to, let's say that you just made a bunch of money. My brother, based on a true story, once when he was very young, it was barely legal for him to do so. He learned how to play poker and then went and won a sizable amount of money across a couple days playing poker. Now, when I think about the attribution of his behavior, he was successful. It's not just he played poker, it's he was very successful. If I made an internal attribution and that was stable, I think that he won because he has high ability. That is something about him internally, and also that doesn't change much from like 1 minute to the next. His ability doesn't keep changing. But if I made an internal attribution that is unstable, I might say that he did so well because he was highly motivated. That again is something internal to himself, but your motivation to complete a task varies from situation to situation. Yeah, he's highly motivated when he's winning money in a poker game, but he might not be highly motivated at other situations. External attribution in this case would be, I think that he did well in poker because of something outside of himself. A stable external attribution might be task difficulty. Just so happened that he was playing poker with other inexperienced people, so the task was very difficult. He just did better at it than other people, right? He did well because of something outside of himself, and he would have done just as well in another situation with the same level of difficulty on the task. And external and unstable attribution might be that, oh, he won because he was lucky. He did really well. That's not anything to do with him. It's because he was lucky. And luck is something that changes from one situation to the next. It's not a trait that is stable that you keep with you. Okay. Do I know the reality in this situation? I actually don't. He's not a gambling person, so he never really did that again. He kind of took his winnings and went on. I don't know if the reality is that he just had great ability to do this, or he was just highly motivated, or he was lucky. But my brain is automatically making this attribution of his behavior, whether I find out the reality or not. Another term that you need to be familiar with is the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate personal factors, ignoring the power of the situation when you make a causal attribution. This is something that applies to a lot of the topics that we're talking about in a social psychology course. Humans tend to, in general, across a lot of scenarios, overestimate how much personal control people have over their reaction to a situation. The reality is typically that the power of the social situation also has a lot of influence on our behaviors. We know the basics now of attribution theory. The attribution theory framework in academic psychology is looking at not only when we make what kinds of attributions, but what are the results of those attributions. For example, if you make internal attributions about someone, does that make you like them more or less? If you make internal versus external, stable versus unstable attributions about yourself, is that better or worse for your psychological or physical health? So let's look at some specific facts we know about when people make certain kinds of attributions. We tend to make more personal attributions, more internal attributions for someone's behavior under specific circumstances. One is if a certain behavior is unexpected for a given situation, we tend to think that it was something about the person that caused them to engage in that behavior. I'm going to go back to the library example. If I go to the library with a group of friends and most of them become very quiet, they are whispering, for example, in the library, I am kind of going to view, okay, the power of the library, the power of the situation is what's causing them to be quiet. But if somebody does an unusual behavior, we walk into the library and they continue to talk very loudly, I'm going to say, okay, I don't think the library is causing you to talk loud. I just think you're a loud person, making a dispositional attribution about them being very loud. Another non-surprising one is if a person is kind of taking control and clearly choosing what behavior they're exhibiting, you think that it's more in their control and not part of the situation. Another time you might make a dispositional attribution is if someone's behavior is consistent across very different situations. I get my cousin to drive go-karts with me. He gets super competitive when we do that. I get my cousin to play a board game with the rest of us. He gets super competitive when we do that. I get my cousin to, do some trivia with us at a trivia night. He's super competitive when he does trivia. If he's exhibiting the same behavior across different situations, I think that it would be kind of a waste of my mental energy for me to think, okay, here's a list of all the things he's competitive at. Let's keep testing this. I don't think he's a competitive person. The more efficient way for my brain to work would be like, okay, I've observed him. He gets really competitive across these different situations. I bet he's competitive in general. So I'm making a dispositional attribution about him being competitive. Something else that can change the attribution you make towards someone else's behavior is what features of a situation tend to be salient at a given point in time. Let me give an example of that. I'm going to go have dinner with one of my friends. I've never met any of his family before, but I decided to join them, and we are about to eat together, and they decide to say a prayer before we eat. Let's say that I don't really notice any religious symbols in their house. Nobody's wearing anything, for example. I might make the determination that, okay, is this something to do with the situation, or is he, praying before we eat because that's what his parents want him to do, or because he's religious? If there's no kind of indication whether he is or not, I might make a situational attribution. However, he's wearing a cross on a necklace. This isn't just because we're in his parents' house. He's a religious person. I'm going to make a dispositional attribution about his participation in that behavior. The next item is need for cognition, which is more about me than it is about other people when I'm judging their behavior. If you have a high need for cognition, that means that you are overanalyzing social situations that you're a part of. You're looking for more information to help you understand why people are making the decisions that they're making. This is going to change the attributions you make because you're picking up more information, possibly about the social environment. So someone high in need for cognition is going to put a lot of analysis into why people make the decisions they make. Someone low in need for cognition is going to go with their gut judgment rather than do the over-analysis. This leads to the next difference is that people tend to fall into one of two broad categories that we're calling entity theorists or incremental theorists. This refers to what kinds of theory you make about why someone else is engaging in certain behaviors. Entity theorists look at a person's traits as stable and not changing. Incremental theorists look at personality as something that changes over time. So if you are an entity theorist, you might look at someone's behaviors in light of their personalities not changing much over time, whereas an incremental theorist is more likely to see changes in their behavior as maybe motivated by their personality changing. There are differences in how different cultures tend to analyze or attribute the causes of different people's behavior. There are some general patterns between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures tend to focus more on the influence of the social group than individualistic cultures, but that's an overgeneralization. This varies from specific place to specific place. I think it's important to acknowledge that the attributions you make about someone else's behavior and circumstances can radically alter how you respond to a situation. I'd like to look at some recent examples of psychology studies that show that the attribution you make about someone else really matters. First, we'll talk about this research team from Australia looked at whether or not someone is likely to intervene if they witness domestic violence happening. The researchers looked at the attributions that someone makes about how the victim got into the situation, whether they're a victim of a domestic violence dispute, and their attributions toward the perpetrator. Why is the perpetrator engaging in that domestic violence? And they found that indeed, when witnesses have more dispositional attributions about the victim, they're less likely to say that they would intervene and help. In the next study, the scientists were looking at, this is an applied research study, where they're trying to change people's attributions toward women who are suffering from postpartum depression. They tried, for example, showing that people support women more when the postpartum depression is viewed as stable rather than unstable, and when it's viewed as out of the woman's control. So by changing how we view postpartum depression, the attributions we make about the situation, we can increase or decrease the likelihood that people will offer these women support and help. And the last applied research study I have here as an example comes from a team of researchers in Brazil who are looking at the stated attributions that government officials gave when discrepancies in how state funding was distributed were found. In other words, it looks like that the state funds were not being distributed due to who has the highest need, but there may be some corruption going on where money is not going to people who need it. It's going to people who have connections. And indeed, they found that when it is likely that corruption might be happening, the attribution people are making about that is that it's outside of any personal control. The situation is forcing them to distribute these funds to people who just happen to be, benefiting from it. So attribution theory can be used as a way to look at why we help or don't help. It can be used as a way to design an intervention to push us toward helping people in need. It can also be used as an analysis for real world behaviors that are happening. How do we explain these real world behaviors? Can attribution theory help us look at a situation? And going back to talking about attribution theory and self attributions, unsurprisingly, researchers have found that certain attributions are more or less beneficial for your own mental health. If you constantly are experiencing negative events and you view those negative events as caused by your personality, your own traits, that can be bad for your mental health, right? You're late to work. Well, if you can view being late to work as a result of the situation, it was traffic's fault, you don't personally have any stress over that. Whereas if you make an internal attribution, you were late to work because I'm late to work, I'm a lazy person. Over time, that can increase your stress over the situation. Similarly, making unstable attributions can be good. I was late to work today, but I can be on time tomorrow. It's not a stable feature that you're always going to do a bad thing. And finally, when it comes to doing positive things, making a global attribution can be good. I did good on that test I took yesterday. I think it's because I'm a good student. That's a global attribution that can be helpful. But I was late for work today because I'm bad at work. That's a global attribution about your negative behavior, and that can actually increase your stress levels, be worse for your, how you view yourself and ultimately your own mental health. Think about think about why, anytime you engage in a behavior, good or bad, your brain is going to try to interpret for you why it thinks you did that. Be mindful of the attributions you are making of your own behavior. All right, here's our references for this presentation, and that's where we'll end here. I really want to end on that message of just try over the next few days after watching this lecture. Try to catch yourself when you're making attributions about someone else's behavior or attributions about your own behavior, and see if you can notice whether your brain is making a dispositional or situational attribution, whether it's stable, unstable, global, or local, for example.